Hello everyone, today we talk about the Anglo-Saxon missionaries and the Latin Germanic armed clienteles in the construction of the Europe of the Franks and of Rome. Um, Talking about missions, such as the one of Boniface, the Anglo-Saxon one, is one of the most fundamental pillars in the history of Western civilization, and even though it becomes controversial today's popular culture, basically does just because fundamentally people, I think, don't understand that history anymore, and or have in fact prejudices regarding properly the entire narrative, the entire mindsets, and the same history of religions. As you know, on my channel, I often acknowledge, that acknowledged by myself, of course, but it's something I get from the broader world where I live, that even the most basic understanding of history of religions, for example, is completely wrong in mass culture. Like, people cannot distinguish. It's not that there is a minority version of the story of people who think they know anything. Properly, there is zero, nothing. Like, if we start talking about paganism or Christianity, there is no form of education, culture, awareness, not even by those people that are actually from, say, are interested in the same religions. It's all kind of a modernistic, secularistic superstition that has nothing to do with any historical reality that we trace scientifically in the past. And as a consequence, the broader meanings of what Romano-Germanic history has been about, and keeps being, in a sense, and deeply, again, at the root of Western culture, is completely missed, right? These great chapters of just even Christian history per se, right? This has nothing to do with being Christian, not being Christian. This has to do with the fact that, first of all, if you don't study history of Christianity, it's useless for you to study anything else in the entire history of mankind. I mean, literally, even if it's from the other side of the globe, of people that even hear about Christianity, it's useless for you to learn anything. Close books, because it's over, right? It's game over. It doesn't make any sense. You can't do profitably other things, especially manual jobs, etc. But leave history alone, because at that point you just cannot afford culturally to understand anything about these topics. And there is hatred towards Christianity. There is hatred at some point against paganism. For a bit the same, in fact, monotheistic dynamics that have come to spread among masses, especially with statalism, collectivism, nationalism, socialism, that have completely alienated, in fact, humanity from a scientific and moral understanding. So whether you speak of the forced conversion, I don't know, of the Saxons, and or the martyrdom of the Anglo-Saxon missionaries, or the same, I don't know, destruction, for example, of the Irminsul, and or the Donner's Oak by Boniface, or by Charlemagne, and the broader ecclesiological policy, right? The direction of Rome, and also the competition with Saint Frankish Church and the Pippinids, Carolingians. It's always a matter of taking sides and saying, I don't like these guys because they did this, right? And I like this guy because they did that. But whenever it gets to understanding the actual mechanism of why it happened, right, or how it happened, even just, that's completely irrelevant, right? And that's where most people stop and cannot find any meaning in narrative. We've gotten habituated to this point specifically, not being deprived of the necessity of meaning, right? Knowledge gets compartmentalized in a sort of, I need this because somebody said that, this is an idea that I should own. I need this and I don't need to learn anything about anything else. Tradition, universality is completely opposed as anything moral and scientific to this form of reasoning, so that I confront myself with lots of students, young learners, people also of my age, frankly, that are just maybe there's always some kind of historical interest somewhere. Like it's rare to find a person that completely doesn't care about history in general, and there's nothing easier to understand somebody's world just through their historical taste, is what they get interested in and what they of course especially pick within a sea of otherwise of complete ignorance about anything else. And this is the entire point of the story, that the meaning that was also a sacred meaning that stood at the very root of the Christian, of the pagan tradition, and of both of them actually blended together. But because when we talk about Romano-Germanic civilization, we're talking essentially about this. We're talking about a hybrid, an extremely powerful one, an extremely powerful blend that managed to take over Europe in a way that had never been seen with the same degree properly of, synthesis capacity, right, of civilizations. Again, you cannot afford a cultural development as a human being, and there's nothing to do about that. Just live your life like an automaton. There's nothing fundamentally you can do. This is a transcendental meaning that goes far beyond any strictly ethnic or just even country contingency. This is the meaning of humanity entire, right? So not regarding it, pretending that in the hierarchy of cultures and civilization this dimension does not exist, it means to deny the entirety of mankind. And this is the meaning that I provide you with, right? I'm not going to make a flat relativistic history where, every single country I discuss, it's, they're the nice guys, the superheroes, and, that's it, happy ending. It's never like that, right? Universality and tradition entails the concept of doom, by the way, and of a transcendence that if you have not assessed properly as a cultural value, basically denied that same culture truth, right? Most people just reason in nationalistic and socialistic terms. National socialism as the very root of anti-European tradition, the hardcore universal traditional one, which is radically violent. It's not like you say, because you're saying the point, it's national socialism versus before all peoples were, again, free and happy. No, there were superior people and lesser people, and the difference was made because of moral race. It was not due to the fact that you're the stinky motherfucker being born in a shitty piece of land that you think it's special. It's about your quality as a freaking human being that you have forgotten because nobody has ever taught you, nor your family, nor your school, nor your fucking stinky country. And that's exactly the point. That's the entire point of the story. This did not exist. People were superior at the time to us. And, quite simply so, because we are the one who complicated the story. Reality, the world, is quite self-evidently the one people thought it was like in the past. In a world that has practically forgotten even the meaning of sacred, what is the meaning of anything, including yourself? Let's not even talk about, things like your country, whatever. That's the point of the story. And that's how they conflicted naturally also at the time in their own view and their own way to it. Because there are different ways and there are different backgrounds that surely do make the difference, but that need to see the worth of that culture at work and the success of it, right? And if things went in a certain direction, the idea is that, there's the evil guy, the evil that simply, won, because after all, we got wars, right? The point is that where were those super special people at the time to prevent this opposing? Like, let's suppose you root with the Saxons or with the Frisians. The other day, just random thing I do, rarely, must say, first comment I saw on the video about Carolingian crowning is that, the average idiot comparing Charlemagne to Hitler because of what they did in Saxony, right? Of course, at university, I don't make this person pass an exam, but that's properly the point. If those were the pure special heroes, of course, if you're rooting a socialistic view of mindset where the Saxons are just the pure people that live ecologically, in their pure peaceful world where they don't harm anyone, and this terrible brute Frankish warriors arrived just to massacre and rape and killing them, and the Saxons didn't do anything, of course, well, you're just done for. But even if you root instead in the kind of, in fact, national socialistic view of, we were the Saxons, we're the toughest ones, the bravest, the coolest. Why were you destroyed, like, not as a people, because you went on, and as Christians, and even, being part of the Holy Roman Empire, like Germans that are Christians and Romans at the same time. Didn't you revert to paganism? Why didn't you, win against the forces of evil? Because you see, their own religion, their own tradition was based on that, right? If you are the stronger rules, that's the only way they saw it. So why didn't they win? Why didn't they rule? Because they were weak, they were inferior to themselves, and this is the story of the tension of the power form between the traditional universal powers of the of the Uranic and of the Teutonic, represented by Charlemagne and the Frankish Empire altogether, the Carolingians, and the Roman Church that also were compenetrated in both ways anyhow, because we know how much Western Christendom was soaked in moral superiority drawn from the militaristic and actually warrior culture of the same West, and that was conjugated with an important military one of the same Judaic tradition, but elaborated in a very particular way in the West, to have this balance, right? Certain cultures were not balanced religiously, spiritually speaking. They either saw just, the supremacist, the exclusively idealistic element that didn't have to be combined and didn't have to compromise with anything in order to make things work. And or even when, because of course every culture had its own chthonic Dionysian dimension, whenever they also managed to affirm control on the latter, because that's the function of the Uranic Apollonian one, they met with civilizations that were objectively superior than them. They had a greater power in both ways. I mean, how and why were the Franks in Rome superior to the pagan Saxons? Well, by the simple fact that they were what they were. They were an empire, they were a church, they were something immense that kept together the will of millions and millions, that gave power to them. Because there was not at the time any way to kind of constrictively coerce on kind of a totalitarian fashion anyone, right? Everybody knows even just how the conquest of Saxony was carried out, right? It's not that there was a hard stock, kind of homogeneous absolute resistance to the Carolingians, and nobody had, the same Widukind baptized in front of Charlemagne. And so the other Saxons did, and in many other ways that even in the, Anglo-Saxon missions, frankly, display the actual conviction of the local people in actually the Christian superiority. When Boniface struck down Donner's Oak, well, everybody said, why is this guy not struck down? A thunder had to arrive and kill him. It didn't happen, right? He was killed by a bunch of martyrs who wanted to sack, his treasury, and found that the treasury was made up of manuscripts, right? And there is a gradual and yet consistent ecclesiastical organization that developed and helped giving these peoples what they lacked in terms of greater power that eventually achieved, as this was a civilizational force that developed those countries towards the world that we know, in the positive aspects of that, and that we completely are losing again. So I'm extremely brutal about this because, frankly, I don't give a damn about what happened in terms of sheer violence from one side or the other. The Saxons harassed the Franks for centuries. They took out other pagan people next to them. They got what they deserved, and they didn't basically receive any exterior help. Given that the Slavs that bordered them in the east simply attacked them in the time of Charlemagne, eventually to fight against the Franks later on. There wasn't a broader coalition that kind of was preventing the Christianization of the North. The North, like, in case you didn't notice, was Christianized by nobody invading it. Iceland converted autonomously within 2 generations, right? Everything went smoothly. Nobody obliged anybody from the external. What are we talking about? How can you be so blind in front of the evidence that there was a massive superior civilization? It was expanding like hell, starting from the Frankish world, from the Roman papacy, into something that would have taken over the entire West and made of it what was the superior civilization in the world till to this day, right? What's so wrong about that? I tell you what, it's ethno-nationalism. It's people buying, since the age of the revolution, a radically leftistic ideology based on national socialism that makes them believe that they're special, again, just because they are born in some place, and they think that for some reason people who lived 1300 years ago were them, because that's the point, right? There is also a filthy obsession for Nordicism that I can't think of any other reason but essentially a cultural complex of inferiority compared to the achievements of the continent, of the Latin Germanic civilization that has been overly emphasized in the last generations. So sort of coming back also for the hysteria against, for example, the same Vikings, the same paganism. So there is no balance. And I tell you because there is no balance, because you don't know what balance is, because you have never studied tradition. You never studied universalism. You don't know effectively what pagan religion was and what Christian religion was, and how de facto were practically the same thing. But nobody told you. Because again, no one around you has ever studied in a real way on an actual historiography that you can consult in a broader, intellectual developed way, the actual meaning of those religions that to you have been portrayed in just a Marxistic, secularistic, modernistic, and completely unsacred and devoid of any meaning fashion. And that's how you're trained to reason, like an animal, right? And then you wonder why people lose kind of respect towards each other, because objectively some people do not deserve any respect. And we should start to set the hierarchy quite directly so, because frankly there's no other reason to live. Right? If you are worthless, you should be treated as such, right? You should be provided with the opportunity of, proving yourself in a fair way. But if you fail, as basically the overwhelming majority of people do all the time, for no reason, because they literally have everything that, by the way, these people here in the past didn't even dream to dare to think it was possible. Again, you're nothing. And the traditional religion of the Saxons, of the Franks, of the Romans was all about this, the same Christianity. If you have not lived without even the concept of transcending human nature in your mind, you will disappear into nothingness, and the kingdom of heaven will be only for those souls that we will have managed to transfigure, right? The decisive difference in many ways being the medium that existed, right? In the Judeo-Christian tradition, there is a medium. In the old pagan tradition, there was not such medium, but as asymptotically tending towards the infinite, do you know anybody who has transfigured in your lifetime, right? Or that can be historically seen as such? Having done so in a consistent way, does it really matter? Does it really matter, whether you think it how abstractly could be if you still don't, right? And so there is something about Christendom, especially conjugated in the Western way of it, that properly set the uniqueness of a certain civilizational development, and still in the idea of a fallen reality that is degenerating, right? But there can be tail strikes. It's not about the substance, but about the form. You can always create a form. If you stop creating forms, if you stop creating empires, if you stop creating a hierarchy, and you will never know whether you will be the one, right? If you fail, you're a loser. Point. If you succeed, you are the chosen one, right? And that's why these peoples became Holy Roman, right? They became Christian Roman because the universal meaning of those cultures was the one of having restored the golden age in the world, which no other culture ever did, right? And again, if you don't get the reference, what I'm talking about, not about what is the golden age, but why am I referring to Christianity and Romanity, you cannot, again, afford to understand any history. Any. It's not that you can say, oh, well, but I will study the 1970s. No, you can't understand that if you don't understand these things. That's the point. And I want to be ever more brutal about this in my content, because frankly, I'm kind of fed up of all the broader, entitlement in terms of, I have an opinion, so it has to be valid. What is even your opinion made of? Right? Doesn't even have any consistency. It doesn't even stand on its feet. Is it based on any actual historical knowledge? Are you even, making the effort of checking whether what you're saying corresponds to the actual historical evidence in a broader fashion, not searching for, 2 or 3 points somewhere randomly and building something on it, not actually reading the entire history in a way that makes any sense. Of course, you've been habituated to think that this is even possible. This is what materialism, determinism, relativism have made to you. Again, you have been trained as a dog just to obey passively to a superstition. And you maybe spit on Christianity that you don't even have the objective intelligence to understand from a moral or scientific point of view, because you think that it's some strange kind of thing. If you get the essentials, like 2 or 3 lines in a note, you understand it. You have to spit blood, rather, and sweat tears for decades, even before, pretending to dream about understanding having a minimal glimpse of it. That's the point. And this kind of effort was completely clear to somebody who would carry out bloody campaigns for decades against Saxony. And from the other side, Saxons who existed equally for decades in the most appalling conditions. Right? Are you capable of doing that? No. You're not better than people in the past. You've never been. You cannot afford to be. Simply because you don't believe in anything. You don't have any faith. You don't have any notion of the sacred. And ultimately, for this reason, you're worthless. Right? And we're all trying to be better. Like, it's not I'm saying here, I'm, the one who understands it. I just have seen something, and I have understood that the world lives in complete darkness. And so I'm still sorting out what this is. Well, I see nothing else anywhere, not an alternative, another view. It's form versus chaos, right? There is no alternative. So I care very much about this premise. Now, as you know, the most famous Anglo-Saxon mission of the 8th century that we talk about today as a period was the one of Winfrid, right? Or Weinfurt, I don't know how you pronounce exactly, but he was a noble from Wessex, the kingdom of Saxons along the Channel. He was a scholar, eventually master in certain monasteries and that were strictly loyal to the Roman Church, by the way, as the Anglo-Saxons were, especially in these areas. And he was, a cultured individual, and we actually don't know much about him. We don't even know where he was from. Probably Exeter. Some think there are other traditions. They're all unverified and unverifiable. He became a priest when he was around 30. He probably was familiarly connected with the local monasteries where he made his career, so much that he would have had to become an abbot himself. But that's the point where he left Britain for the continent in this missionary zeal, operating, famously enough, for decades autonomously. This is the important thing, in Germany, against the polytheism of Thuringians and Saxons, and he died as a martyr among the Frisians in 754. I made a video about the Kingdom of Frisia, by the way, which we describe a bit more in depth, kind of the phases during which, in fact, Winfried, that was cooperating with Willibrord, that was already there, made proselytism and managed to, in fact, to win over to Christianity lots of locals, but still being fundamentally impeded in carrying out this, in a stable fashion, because of the wars that were being fought between Charles Martel and the Frisian monarchs that took basically any chance to escape Frankish expansionism at the time. The Frisians bordered in the center of Frisia was in the south, right? But in the northeast they bordered at the Weser estuary with Saxon, right? This is also interesting because the upper Weser had been kind of also the Frankish homeland before. And in fact, we're talking about the 8th century. It's not that there were radical differences between these peoples, except the Carolingians at that time, the Pippinids, which Charles Martel eventually would give the name Carolingians, were, as you know, consolidating an unprecedented power that was fundamentally overlapping with the ancient Merovingian one that had disgregated by the end of the 7th century, and that the Pippinids-Arnulfings were restructuring through the, let's say, on the riding the wave of European demographic and economical expansion was recovering by strengthening their private military clienteles as majors of palace and eventually as kings. Just 1 year before Boniface's death, that is Winfried, the Carolingians had succeeded to the last Merovingians that also were kind of, especially the last one, Chilperic III, was just a random guy taken as a Merovingian to make still the fiction that this dynasty was sacred, was essentially conferring the same Carolingians the legitimacy to rule, and the Pope stepped in and made the Carolingians kings of the Franks. And the Franks were at this point fueling, in fact, this new military organization based on de facto professional bulk of heavy cavalrymen that were superior to anything that Western Europe had ever produced cavalry-wise. And they were systematically subjugating the surrounding peoples that had always fundamentally been gravitating around the Frankish Empire as it had been established by the Merovingians, but that at this point also with some ambition on their own, because they were also expanding. They had been gradually also civilized by osmosis, right? Germany had been colonized by the same Merovingians during the early Middle Ages. That generally also those peoples that had escaped Frankish control were growing because the world does develop after all. at least materially wise, and thus the attrition would increase. Right, so when you talk about the Frisians or the Saxons saying, these poor peoples that, were just escaping, they were trying to be free, right, on their own. But being free, it doesn't actually tell anything of what you're able or capable to do with that freedom, right? The Franks achieved something because they were essentially working on the shoulders of the Gallo-Roman civilization. They had been reinforcing that system and also marrying with the Roman Church straight away without strange Arian heresies along the way. And these other pagan peoples in the surroundings, and they were not very different from the same Eastern Franks in Austrasia, from which the same Carolingians, and maybe because of their warlikeness also, they came from. But they were different, right? They were less developed, right? Whether you like it or not. Their mindset, their beliefs, their political and social structure did reflect that, right? Because this paganism was relatively naive compared to the, say, as a culture, broadly speaking, compared to the intensity that, after all, their own same universal creed had instead taken form again in France and in Rome, and thus they opposed themselves naturally to such subjugation. It was brutal because the Franks were some of the most radically violent peoples that ever lived on the earth, but they were also because they were capable of doing that, right? It's not that a Saxon or a Frisian were better when they raided the Rhineland, raping, killing, exterminating, right? I've actually met in the world, like, there are some psychopaths today that just are okay with that because there were Christians from the other side, right? We have this mentally ill people living among us that do not understand even the fact that eventually they got, steamrolled, and they identify themselves with again, that pagan tradition that they don't even know what it means, but to them it means like being a way of being, alt-right or whatever they think. National socialism is actually like historically wise, to mirror it on this, to project this on these events, and it's quite disturbing to see this in the first place, but it's also kind of satisfying on the other to simply show the evidence of what happened. That again, where was your freedom, your power, your capacity, your civilization, your culture when these things were happening? Yes, there were people dying for that, but did the system make it? Like, as Clausewitzians, I taught this by commenting the Formkriege. Like, if your country cannot, basically, that doesn't even receive an external help, it's because nobody really thinks that it can defend itself. Right, so if you don't prove that you can defend yourself, there can't even be any broader comparticipation to this, and simply the general lack of coordination with other populations who were hostile to the Franks, like the Danes, etc., didn't bring to anything because they were simply not capable. Right, they were not capable because their same communities were split, because some recognized and understood the importance of what was happening, that hierarchies were expanding, that the necessity of Christianization and Frankization was evident in front of everyone. It was not really a matter of option. They believed, of course, in something that they didn't want to give up formally, also because they were heavily ritualized religions that in their own way they controlled the people. This is the other thing. Christianity controlled the people. The pagans were free. Do you have an idea of how they actually lived? Do you know how, say, in Germanic law actually worked? What freedom or egalitarian stuff actually means in a Germanic society? Have you ever studied that? Because I did, right? And I see, again, lots of people today pretending that that was a heaven where people were free, where in the rest of Europe there were crosses everywhere, and everybody was begging in front of them and frustrating themselves. Do you have an idea what were the standard, the quality of life, let's say, of places like Gaul or Italy compared, let's say, to Denmark? Like, just even, comparatively, have you ever read anything? Do you even know what was in other countries like? Because most of these people don't. Because, of course, by studying only your own history doesn't provide you any kind of substance to the same. Because, if you don't give a perspective to the rest of the world, what's the relevance of your country even? Right? It's just a delusion. It's an abstract. In fact, they don't know anything about this. But this is valid for everyone. I've met lots of nuts from all of these other countries who frankly believe that, I don't know, their people were special, most advanced than anybody else. On which base? You ask them, the interesting thing is that they immediately back down, because you make them the simple question of, evidence in that they don't know where to start from, because of course they had never learned any history, right? And after all, it's even simple, like understanding these things, it can't even be done from a normal manual. Like, you don't have a science, right? The fact that you ignore these dimensions means that you didn't even begin to study what, normally an 18-year-old should know. To me, like, I don't know, I made a lot of videos about the Christianization of Europe, etc., but it's sometimes difficult not to say these things out loud, because people like my content to be balanced, etc., but this is the actual history. Like, it's not the other, again, non-controversial, kind of simply descriptive and non-judgmental side of the story. That's not history. That's history for students, not for professionals. It's meant at that point to just give you the basis of the fact that some of these things even existed. You can't pretend a student to have those comparative capacities, but it's very important methodologically to set these standards straight since the beginning, and in fact countering the hysterical, paranoid, morally relativistic obsession of people that do not want to be confronted with reality. We are creating young people that cannot stand reality, do not have any resistance to anything, right? And this is typical, again, of those who do not know, those who cannot do, those that do not understand what it takes to work hard, or to know how to evidence something, how to substantiate or giving form to that something. That's all what people's brains are turning into. And this is all, this is not just young people. I say young people because for them there is maybe some hope still. Well, okay, for most people, Generation Z is done for. They'll be all slaves. But I mean, even, people once reasoned nobody really reasoned straight on average in this, again, mass society, but let's say at least there was someone who could understand, right, by accepting being challenged in ideas. And today that thing is properly put aside. Like, people don't want to feel that. They don't want to be told that all what they have been told is bullshit, even though it's the case, because they never questioned that. And that's the problem of it all, right? I don't start basically from any preset ideological base, right? I learned all things the more I learned history. And I learned history from texts that do not even frame these things in this way, because they just provide you with, information, and then you have to build that up, right? And the meaning, comparatively, diachronically, is this one, right? What is extremely important, as I was saying at the beginning, is that the conversions that Winfried managed to achieve among those Germanic peoples constituted an heroic and pacific phase of Christianity penetration, right? It is true that they were comforted by the political support of the Pippinids, but not entirely. You see, as we were just saying, why would these peoples convert to Christianity? Because of course it offered a dramatic civilizational model. They provided with an administration system, with a bureaucracy, with a more permanent solid base of power. These peoples already ruled on populations that had fundamentally lost a great part of their freedom, right? They were ruled by the mob. They were ruled by these chieftains that fundamentally were gaining ever more power, were differentiating ever more from the mass, because they were starting, the same mass was giving them that power. And the same goes with these chieftains, with the Carolingians themselves, that co-opted them when they were not opposing themselves to the Frankish expansion. Because it was the elites that were, of course, loaded with the greater moral and material superiority in virtue of the fact that they had won it on the base of their capacity. And the masses had lost it, or in part had just said, okay, I prefer to be under a fair master rather than, finding my, trying to survive out there because it's less convenient. And they accepted that. They stopped making the effort, and they fell under this control. And the same goes for the broader Carolingian system. It was a brutal world. I'm not saying that it was not an oppression, that it was not a control that was surely, quite hideous to these peoples that had been habituated to live in a different way. But again, who were these people? Again, it was the clan leader that controlled lots of other peoples that also didn't like him at all. Right? And it's always kind of the case. And the question you have to pose yourself is, why would the person withstand that state of things? We're talking about the 8th century, right? It's not that a leader, even if they wanted, they could simply impose their rule if this rule was not accepted for some other reason, right? At a broader political level, again, it was essentially the ultra-elite was trying to centralize, and of course they needed the Romano-Germanic Christian models. The rest of the nobility that was championing, in this case mostly the ethnic Germanic perspective, actually didn't give a damn. As soon as they could seize power, they would immediately adopt Christianity themselves, right? Or if they didn't, still the thing was not favorable to them, because others rebelled from the within, right? And on the long run, the system stabilized. By the way, the monarchies, the states we know today. So it's paradoxical, again, that kind of hatred by National Socialists towards something that in a statalistic and collectivistic sense in the much longer run, like 1 millennium later, would make them essentially obtain the mindset they have, actually stemmed from the same alleged, rape of their culture, whatever, right? There is naturally a lot of, also of Christian bias in the sources. This is absolutely true. Of course, these people didn't write, which, it's not the Christians' fault if these people didn't have a literature, right? So that's also a question that you should pose yourself. It's not that there was a hidden secret civilization that was ultra advanced and the terrible Christians arrived to destroy anything. Actually, there was a very few to destroy, right? If your main symbol is the Irminsul, well, we're talking about essentially a sanctuary, a natural shrine, right? It's not a massive, consistent, some structural form of civilizational effort that you put there. Basically decided that tree is sacred and you stuck to that, right? Elsewhere in the world, where people ruling from Spain to the Elbe, from Brittany to Rome, and essentially having put together the largest power ever seen since West Roman times in the West, and developing and building on a dramatic cultural, development and hierarchical system that was hyper-loaded in moral strength and values. We have seen that in the video about Charlemagne's coronation. What was behind the Romano-Germanic Christian imperial ideology? It was a dramatically coherent belief with the entire traditional universal creed. The same one other peoples believed, but they had not been capable of achieving. Again, what was the average belief of a Saxon or a Dane? To take over the world, to be the most powerful ruler ever that all the rest of the people had to obey to you. That this was the entire meaning, the entire system. And when Winfrid was martyrized among the Frisians, according to the story, what does he do? He actually had a retinue of armed men, of his followers, that they were expecting at that point an enormous mass of Frisians to come there to be baptized, as it had already been happening previously during this, pretty troubled moments between during the various truces of the war between the Frisians and the Carolingians. And he said, according to the story, to keep their swords down, not to offend those who were coming there armed to kill them, because they had to make good just by example, which was a Christian conception. You say, here is the, turn the other cheek concept. Do you know what turning the other cheek actually means, really? Because the point there is an Alexandrian symbol, is the idea that of the, still of the Bronze Age demigod warriors, lords that came to rule and wouldn't even have to unsheath their swords to be obeyed, right? It's a very old traditional symbol, right? If you are pure, if you are a saint, if you can afford eventually to win the ultimate struggle against death, so which is the same identical ideology of, again, the pagan tradition of what the warrior can do. You can transfigure yourself, in the Christian case still through Jesus, but fundamentally as the angel of death, that is your say enlightened soul appears like the Valkyrie in the pagan tradition. So Jesus appears in the Christian one because that's the greatest moment, it's the greatest battle, is the pure chaos and suffering where your soul has to prove to be superior to any form of pain to win itself. This is the same identical meaning in the pagan tradition, right? When people think about Jesus being killed in this idea, this is a passive idea, the symbol of enslavement, being crucified like a common, as the lowest of criminals, etc. That is a psychomachia. It's the same ideal that, again, existed in the Bible, existed in any other religion at the time. All universal traditions was based on the same concept of the soul managing to win everything, including your own killing. And that's why the term martyr, that in Greek fact means witness, comes about. Because it was witnessing, again, the angel of death and your own transfigured soul, in the case of the Christians, the Son of Man, and that the meaning there is pretty limpid, to achieve immortal life in heaven, right? If, again, you pick the average layman today and you compare the Anglo-Saxon missionary, by the way, what comes from the Anglo-Saxon nobility that does believe in pretty similar things, again, to the Frankish and the Saxon ones, and they're pretty close culturally and ethnically, and this Frisian slayers that we somewhat want to stereotype as warriors, or at least some people who were more habituated to use violence than the priests, definitely we see, no, this is a clash of civilization, it's war of religion, it's cultural genocide, it's something terrible. Do you even know what these people reasoned like to think it like that? This is what triggers me like hell, because I think that, again, not seeing it is missing the entire point of what that symbol means. Still, in our culture, what do we think is stronger? The one who just let, his emotions loose like I'm doing now, or those who simply withstand the, any possible pressure without blinking of an eye? This person was being massacred, right? Willingly, and they would kill him. That naturally, again, this is a geography by a certain degree, can be ideological as well, but don't think that the other, traditions were not ideological. There was not like a twisted, again, negative Christian side of the story, and the one of the pure free people from the other side that only said told the truth and everything. There is no evidence anywhere in the world of any of this. because simply we know why, right? We know how those cultures function, right? And again, they were pretty similar with one another in many ways. But that's still the point, right? You would get yourself killed for an ideal. And Winfrid, that had been, renamed Boniface, so from bonum facere in Latin, which means to make good, by the same Pope Gregory III in Rome, being renamed as such, well, actually became the apostle of Germany, right? And became definitely way more famous and inspiring and kind of part of that traditional universal culture than whoever killed him. At that point, we would have probably not known anything anyway, even if there had not been Christian missionaries to get martyrized around, right? So having respect for this is having respect for reason, intelligence, authority, discipline, right? Which is basically what the Indo-European hero was also made of, and what was living, in a sense, within this higher inspiration of the Anglo-Saxon missionaries. That, let's repeat it, the family members of people like Winfrid were Anglo-Saxon warriors, right? So they believed these things as well. I made several videos at this point about Anglo-Saxon warfare, and you know how at this point, especially the 8th century, everything was still soaked in a very kind of archaic, primitive, very, in fact, warrioristic kind of ethos that was known by anyone there. So don't abstract. Don't think that the world is kind of radical categories that are separated from one another, that have nothing to do, because the entire universal tradition tells you that good and evil stand within you all the time. And if you lower the guard because you think that you're better for some reason, you've already lost, because you're already weak to have already ceased to make any effort in your struggle to victory, which is the truth. And it has all the same direction, right? It's just you can go back and forth in that, right? And it takes a lot to go ahead throughout this path. These people were capable of getting themselves killed for a point, for an end, and there are still people like this in the world. Sometimes simple people, sometimes people were really developed and understand these things, but this is for anybody's to witness, because if you believe, again, that this world is somewhat not what it seems, and that you're stuck and trapped into a sort of contingental realization of the same, that is to say, reality is made up of essentially especially the material one, of the weakness created by your own mind, well, you can find that absolute meaning in these values, of course, but properly beyond anything that you have ever thought was meaningful in your life. These people spent their entire life learning of this. If you were an Anglo-Saxon missionary, just by default, even think what it means to travel Central Europe at this point with all these risks. And by the way, it's not that Winfrid had a Carolingian retinue behind at every step of the way. On the contrary, right? He bitterly criticized the dreadful state of the Frankish Church that was absolutely, just decrepit in a properly Christian and ecclesiological sense. The religious officials just got their revenues and then lived in ways that had nothing to do with Christian teachings. They barely anyone could read Latin, even in the clergy, and so on. And it was largely autonomous. These people took essentially the initiative on their own to go there and to have people following them, right, and leaving for the effort and really just converting, right? So that's why I say that this chapter was peaceful, because differently, of course, from the further phase that goes on with the never-ending wars of Charlemagne against the Saxons, there you have definitely a dramatically bloody and based political military operation, right? Even there, the massacre of Verdun is probably part of the same Carolingian propaganda that was actually very positive in saying they had killed a lot of Saxons, even though we think really that that was not the case, that those thousands were not killed. Probably they killed, much less than that, specifically the chieftains. What was the point even causing that massacre of the average people they had to win over as labor and force and manpower, because the Saxons were to work for the Carolingians, were to fight with for the Carolingians in their armies, right? So this is part of a broader system that doesn't stop to the dichotomy that, again, of the cultural clash that you're being fed with constantly, blindly, passively, superstitiously. This has to do with how people made the world work at the time, with the unspeakable lack of resources and pre-statal realities, especially in Central Europe, to build up what we are still living on, right, functionally. So being humble, even just towards this broader phase of acculturation, is, I think, crucial. As we were saying before, the Saxons fight for a long time. The Carolingians knew that because they knew the Saxons well. Once their Saxony is subjugated, so the entire Germany is, and there is no revolt to the system. There is the Stenlinger revolt. Later on, it was more like a social issue at some point. The freemen allied with slaves as well to counter the nobility. That's still a part of that story, but as you know, in Germany, the Eastern Frankish kingdom still had, a very, still unruly system for a very long time. Like the national monarchy there wouldn't even manage to take form, of course, because it was more difficult to make things work in lands that had not known that form of central powers and organization. This naturally made them more difficult to rule and to achieve greater things, unless they had some broader motives in cooperation, including the one that existed in the Renovatio Imperii between the post-Carolingian kingdoms, and especially the basically all of them except the Western Frankish one, that also, however, was much more compact for other reasons, but I made videos about this and I don't need to digress again on them. So the conversion of the Frisians of other Germans by the time of Winfried was, again, as we've seen, autonomous, right, to a point where also Winfried criticized so much the Pippinids that they cut contact with him, but still let him operate, because after all he was still converting other Carolingian subjects factually to Christianity for them. And this, however, strengthened Winfried's connections with Rome, right? And the Romanity here is crucial as well. Whereas the Saxon one, again, was characterized by the emanation of also, at some point, intolerable constrictive norms that brought about also some deportation of the Saxons, and so on, because those groups, those elements were creating more problems. And also priesthood there was used in a sort of politically repressive way as spies, mostly to secular authorities, etc. Whereas, again, most conversion phases were, in this sense, autonomous from an ecclesiastical point of view, and also they simply met with the general favor of the local rulers on the longer run, right? There was not a major force that was kind of keeping Christianity out of places like, say, Scandinavia, or even the rest of Central Europe, the Western Slavs, right? Again, the elites were quite interested in that, because it meant to have finally the possibility of consolidating through a more through an ideology and through also an important material, an administrative capacity that they lacked, lands that required that type of power consolidation. That again, one can see, if one saw this only in terms of oppression, you see, these countries would have self-destroyed themselves, because you destroy the people, you destroy, again, all the labor force and all the manpower. And if you don't have motivation, because again, you have been trained to think that things work just in a material sense, but they work exclusively in an ideal sense, because, even if, again, you lack matter, then you can't even obey to somebody who wants to control you, also because that someone likely has less means to convince you. And so it makes the point. Again, this system joined. The system said, okay, it's better to be a more stable reality and not one torn apart by clan wars and a situation that becomes unsustainable in the long run because of the damage, right? It's not that these peoples gave up their feuds so easily. Their ethos was soaked in that kind of sense of, always never take any offense, never compromise with anything, etc. But don't negotiate. It takes time to civilize in that regard. But at some point, the distractions deriving from the disobedience was so great that they said, you know what, we can't go on living like this. And again, this is the history of the majority, because forced conversion in Saxon style, basically you don't find anywhere else, if not in some regions on the Baltic later on, during the Baltic Crusade. And it was even their complex system that we have seen many times, and where everybody who had something to benefit from somebody else's killing, pagans, Christians alike, they would do it. So where's the difference even in there? Why do you have to draw the line there just between the two religions that are actually still the same as we've seen, but the peoples are also dramatically similar in many ways for those time standards in a pre-industrial reality especially, but still kind of ethnically homogeneous or similar at least. So it's fair to say that the Europe of the Franks and of Rome, as first unitary systematization of the Latin world with great part of the Germanic one, was born to be the root of Western civilization, between vocations to martyrdom and cruel violence. Civilization requires a sacrifice. And again, the entire universal tradition is based on the doctrine of self-sacrifice in the eternal struggle for victory, right? Because without that, you can't achieve anything. It's that simple. What can you get without making an effort? Nothing. Right? And the principles of thermodynamics are pretty clear to remind us every time somebody has the childish delusion of thinking otherwise. At the end of the 8th century, it was the Frankish military organization, integrated by a subjugation of souls through the imposition in the heart of Germany. There were everything. The population and the customs were tribally ordered of a rigorous episcopal fabric. That was essentially the extension of the Frankish ecclesiastical system. That's the concept we were talking about before. That's why the Carolingians were obsessed with, say, David, right, and his star, right? Because in the universal tradition, that was the symbol of the fusion between the feminine and the masculine, between the Apollonian and the Dionysian, the Uranic and the Chthonic, and it meant the domination of the world entire, right, as a universal symbol. And there could have not been a successful, brutal onslaught like the Frankish one if the system had not been mitigated by, the Roman Catholic Church, right? And the task of the latter, especially to evangelize, providing with, a positive, kind of welcoming, functional, reasonable model, right? And I would go as far as saying that the reason why other people lost in front of this is that, as I was saying before, either they were unbalanced without kind of a counter, a counter factor to sheer violence, and this kind of just of blind will to rule without any control, right? This is true also for the same Franks. It had been true for the same Romans back in the day, right? There had to be a counter-altar to that, a dialogue that the Holy Roman Empire did have, right? And that, again, dissolved when the masses, surprise, surprise, were open to collectivism, to statalism, right? And so to National Socialism. And without this, right, the neophytes, the newly converted would have never been won over by Christianity. It was there to stay completely. I was reading another comment the other day, a very old one, because I'm making a bit of cleansing. They had not approved. It said, it's strange how, the same people who, were Christianized at the time, today do not even remember that they had not been Christian before. I think they pretty well know, and maybe what you don't know is that these people were, accepting boys in manhood just when they came back having killed another human being that they didn't even consider as such, right? So maybe before, blaming Christianity for all the terrible evils in the world, maybe getting a primary education in first world country, at least in the places where education still works, right, is not a Catholic institution. I'm talking about the excellence of the elite public, especially continental European education, maybe together also with some cultural background that you cannot afford just by going to any institution, but should maybe be a matter of parental upbringing, would help avoiding saying such bullshit, right? So make yourself a favor in that regard and learn some history, some real one, right? And as you see, I don't make any kind of preachy content about this. To me, and my religious studies, there's not even a real difference between in fact, the various religions we're looking at today in the, again, I'm probably annoying you at this point, the universal tradition. But again, if you don't see that, that's the problem. That's exactly the problem. Having forgotten to the point of non-recognition. I also made a video about this, criticizing the modern, for example, conservative commentators, because they don't really teach any of those who are actually following them to realize that the first problem when things go wrong because of you, right? This is what ancient peoples actually believed. So that's why also the position of why these people lose is untenable, because even if the Franks and the Romans had been the terrible Christian force wanting to eliminate these pure angels, why didn't these pure angels actually succeed? Right? Because their entire religion was based on this concept that you get what you deserve entirely, everything, including illnesses, etc. This was the actual belief. And there is an interesting aspect of this too, is that, speaking of the Irminsul that was destroyed, that is fundamentally like the Yggdrasil in the North Germanic religion, that was destroyed by Winfrid, as you know. The entire point of the North Germanic religion is the one of doom, right? That is present mildly also in the other Indo-European branches, but is more pronounced in the North because it kind of blended with more kind of tonic elements. With the Indo-European population was more rarefied in the older days. And you perfectly know that Yggdrasil's roots are rotten because of the snake of evil that is devouring them, and its icy water freezing them. And so the Asgard will be stormed at some point. We don't know. Well, like the dimming of the twilight of the gods corresponds to the dimming of the humans' awareness of the sacred within their culture. So the tree was destroyed because of what? Of the forces of evil in their perspective. Fine. Where were the good forces, the forces of good at that point? They had decayed, if anything. Right? And so one can see conversely that the power created by the Franks, that also was to go to decline at some point, but still leaving a deep trace that from which Europe blossomed again, probably had left something in that fabric that the same peoples who were conquered were to champion. The Saxons becoming the refounders of the Carolingian Empire and of the Roman Christian Empire. Just think about that. Is it a coincidence? I don't think so, because I think in that regard, actually, that the Saxons brought with them, just like the Franks or the Romans before, that kind of warlike element of belief in dramatic strength and force, and the Uranic masculine Apollonian force that was to inseminate, to ingravidate the rest of the feminine Chthonic Dionysian world and to rule it over. That's why the Augustan era was the golden age. The universal order was restored, and the entire Holy Roman imperial tradition was living within the recognition that the Romans had achieved what no other people in the world had ever done and would ever do, for that matter. So this is the broader meaning you have to reason like. Because the Saxons were not like a bunch of imbeciles that just, lived at the outskirts of the civilized world and were a bunch of brutes and nothing else. They knew these things. They would understand these things. Maybe with difficulty. Maybe they had to taste, Frankish steel. Maybe the gospel stories had to be adapted for them, describing Jesus like a chieftain, with the apostles being his retinue, and insisting on the bloody passages of the Bible to enfervorate the love for the faith for their Lord, which as you know, in the Germanic Comitatus was exactly what the leader of the devotees, the sacred devotees war bands were really feeling like towards, and so those meanings already existed, right? These were being portrayed on a scale that, well, the Saxons and other more primitive peoples had not had properly even yet the civilizational shot to achieve, and actually achieving it in the 10th century with the Holy Roman Empire. This is what we call with the Renovatio of Otto I, etc. So also the broader European meaning of this is the point, because these bloody conquests translated themselves in a deep integration of the entire barbarian world in a Romano-Catholic Europe, right? And this was possible only thanks to the systematic territorial expansion of the episcopate, prepared both by the Anglo-Saxon missionary preaching that conferred to it preemptively the, say, human dignity in prophetic, religious dimensions, and the reconstruction within the Frankish ecclesiastical world of episcopal structures capable of providing a model to this great design project of cultural domination and assimilation entrusted to the new churches founded within the Germanic territories. And you see here there is a cooperation of all elements. This is not just about the Carolingian Empire. It's all Europe here. it's the Anglo-Saxon missionaries that are in constant contact with the papacy, that writes from Rome letters about the actual things that they had to teach, to preach to the newly converted. The Frankish military clientele, the Frankish Burgundian power that was being revived at that point, the other various peoples that were integrated at this point in the empire later on, the Longobards, the Visigoths, and in fact the same Saxons, right? The same Saxons brought their own force, brought their own order, brought their own contribution culturally, civilization to this system as well. And the more you recognize that, the less the more you understand how the brutality of the Saxon wars was not a point of the civilized man versus the savage, right? Whether you want to see it like the good savage or the monster or whatever, they were much more similar at the time, especially again the Austrasians and the Saxons. Come on, they were basically the same thing. It's true that the Frankish center of power most like an Austrian thing, but it was, still a very similar war to one another. And still there were the reasons. Again, the Saxons had been harassing the Rhineland for centuries. The Franks simply said, this has to stop. And they made it stop for good. They massacred tens of thousands of people. Well, and so? Like, is that a problem? Like, how do you make somebody stop if they don't want to stop? You have to pass to the sword. So is this a terrible thing? Like, even the Christianization fundamentally is functional to that. It's not that the Carolingians had an obsession to, I would say, let's take over every single territory for no reason and let's convert it. They didn't work like that. The entire decisional process from a political or strategic point of view, it's largely unknown because we were not Carolingian War Council. We don't have practical sources about that. But it's obvious that behind the ideology that of course was aimed, we were reading it in that video about Carolingian coronation, it was aimed to this, right? The conquest of the world. Because again, no other power had ever thought anything different as a general aim, right? And we're forgetting about today because we accepted we have to be divided and quarrel. These people believed everybody had to stand within a pacified world, an orderly, a just world that is not based on wishful thinking of praying and sending, positive vibes, right? Praying when there is a discipline, praying when this self-fortifies you, praying where you're able to get yourself killed in the name of what you're praying for. Otherwise, it's just, barbaric inferiority. And that has to be cancelled from the face of the earth. And that's basically most of what you see nowadays. That's why I have a huge respect for the Saxons. I mean, this video can be, probably misinterpreted. And I know that whenever I talk about this, I get some form of hatred, or then I never got explicitated. But let's say in the broader sense, I have a huge respect towards properly the dignity of those who were massacred while fighting for defending their own country by the Carolingians. Like the average Saxon farmer that surely maybe was a motherfucker who had participated in raids and whatever, just because for them was normal. It was normal to have slaves, was normal to kill them, to rape them, to do whatever, because it was normal. They had won that as freemen, and the freemen had a sacred nobiliary trait, and they didn't understand what they had to obey to a Carolingian overlord that was bringing this fate that they didn't understand anything of, if anything, because they couldn't even read. And the entire Christian civilization is based on a book, and but still on the verbum meant as wisdom, as the logos, as what, again, all those peoples believed in. And so they still couldn't afford to understand by a certain degree. Well, it was the world of that time, right? I estimate not maybe an individual, but I estimate the capacity of getting yourself killed for a cause, which is, again, something that appears like a mirage nowadays, or at least, among those who should maintain high the honor of the Western civilization. Like it's been built in blood unavoidably, like in these times, to achieve what we have today. Did we earn this? There was a time in which we used to earn this, right? Today it doesn't quite seem to be the case. So, as in the missions on the more eastern fronts, because of course the consolidation of Germany under Carolingian rule opened to an even wider front against the Slavs, and also the Avars, for that matter, but the main force would have been later the Magyars, and still the Western Slavs joined. Also in this Frankish ecclesiastical reconstruction operated with special place in it, the Anglo-Saxon element in connection with the Church of Rome, that, as you know, would have been ever more invested in the Frankish Church, in the imperial one, and would have been at the base of the same Carolingian ecclesiastical reform, that even just for the script, the educational forms, the books, the monasteries, the internal cultural organization would become the fabric of post-Carolingian Europe and save the civilization, right, during the raids of, again, the heathens, the Normans, the Magyars, the Saracens, makes the sap and the pillars of Western civilization, together with all these other elements, right? And so consider there, even the Anglo-Saxon example is quite revealing, because the Anglo-Saxons were under no one, right? They had been Merovingian clients back in the day. Surely in Carolingian times it was an important influence in all these affairs, but these had converted to Roman Catholicism, just like the Franks had always had very cordial relations with the papacy. That spiritual axis permeating and comforting the political action of these peoples was already there, was not enforced. There was no terrible evil guy who arrived, crashed, killed, exterminated, deported. These people already understood the point, already understood this dramatic necessity of cooperation, right? And this is especially from, like, I'm mostly talking to Americans, as I know statistically here, but the second are, say, British, Australian, Canadian audience, etc., etc. I think it's crucial to recover properly from a strictly British perspective, and of course the one of the its various historical emanations. I say really without any offense, but as a compliment, actually, because of this point, exactly, the connection of European universality that was established so early on. Don't get fooled just by the modernistic, secularistic myths, the reform, the nations, etc. Think about what this was at the beginning, right? And how a positive, constructive work and achievement properly is always better than a negative and destructive one. And when the latter happens, you can evaluate whether it's negative or not on the basis of what that destruction actually achieves. If it is actually the same people still existing and cooperating, and even when this external terrible oppressors are gone, they basically stick to their own models. Well, and these models push forward towards a further greater recomposition of universal scale and breadth and ambition. Well, I think you can see there that there was a successful use of violence that is not to be given for granted. Those who want to make empires and fail uh, cannot afford that, right? So always consider everything in perspective. Always consider not a single event extrapolated from itself, but evaluating what was the civilization behind it. A victory or a defeat per se do not mean much. It's those who do what and how and why that actually make the difference. And even in defeat, you see peoples that blossomed, like the same Saxons later on. And that, I believe, is a pretty good lesson what lays at the secret of Western success. Right? That I'm biased as a medievalist, but I think lays its roots exactly in this phase, much more than we have ever dared to consider, and especially against what normally we are told. Because this video I've made so also violent, aggressive, etc., is because this perspective has been eliminated. Right? Again, both left and the right do not understand this anymore. The meaning of this video. How many people are going to watch this? Probably not many, because my channel is what it is, but let's say hopefully in the hope of a growth, and even being able to make 2 + 2 of the first things I say throughout all the hour, whatever 2 hours I've been talking, I don't know. That's the point. They have been told to stop to what they don't understand, and they don't want to. And there is always no worse stupid than he who does not want to understand. So with this beautiful line, I leave you for today. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.